Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation to speak today about Bernard. And I'm delighted to join Harold and Bunzi. They were lights in Bernard's life. I had a more limited role as his student and disciple. So it's from that perspective that I'll make a few remarks on what made him unique and on his view of Middle Eastern studies in particular. I'm going to share my screen so you can see a few things that I want to show in the course of these remarks. Okay. There, by the way, is Bernard with Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, one of the things I check from time to time is fresh references to Bernard. And amazingly, not a day goes by when someone doesn't mention him. It can be a scholarly article or a newspaper item or a post on social media. On Twitter, on some days, not an hour goes by without his name cropping up. I checked today, in the past 24 hours, there were 15 references to Bernard that had nothing to do with this event, by the way. People quote him or misquote him. They take photos of passages in his books and they post them. They praise him, they attack him. The Turks, by the way, do this obsessively. And sometimes it's as if Bernard were still among us. Now, what does this tell us? I think it tells us two things. First, no one has filled his shoes, not as a scholar and not as a public intellectual. And while there are obviously competent scholars here and there, Bernard had a gift. It was a gift for translating the insights of scholarship to laymen. He wrote well, he came across well on the screen, and his crisp English accent spoke authority. Only two Middle East scholars ever pulled off the public role in America. Bernard was one, and as mentioned by Harold, the other was his close friend, Fuad Ajami. You just weren't up to date if you hadn't read both of them in the Wall Street Journal or Foreign Affairs or seen them on a major interview show. Now, the stage that Bernard and Fuad once filled is now empty. Ask any reasonably informed American for the name of an expert on the Middle East or Islam, and he'll draw a blank. Now, there may be more of these experts today than ever before, but more has become less. Second, the issues he analyzed are still relevant. Bernard knew how to identify emerging issues before anyone else and put them in their precise contexts. Now, one context obviously was historical. Bernard was a historian by discipline, whether it was the Iranian Revolution or bin Laden. Bernard showed how the churning history of Islam hurled them onto the front page of the newspaper on our doorstep. But other times the context was semantic, and I think that needs more attention. Bernard was a concert pianist with words. He had a complete and utter mastery of the full range of the English language. Bernard never wasted words, he never stumbled over words, he never misused words. Yes, of course, he taught us the deeper meaning of words in Arabic and Persian, and Turkish and Hebrew, but he also taught us the deeper meaning of words in English. He was an Englishman and also an English man. Now, if an English word came into the public sphere, he saw it as the scholar's first duty to define it accurately. And today, we're barraged, with sloppy use and abuse of terms such as genocide and apartheid and Islamophobia and so on. Bernard would latch onto a contentious term, uncover its origins, and track its evolutions. And then he would define it for present use, always with exact precision. Now, let me give an example that may speak to this audience. Bernard's definition of anti-Semitism. After he came to America, Bernard felt freer to write about Jewish affairs and not just about Islam. He wrote a book, many of you may be familiar with it, Semites and Anti-Semites, and there were articles on the new anti-Semitism in the New York Review and the American Scholar. And there he showed how anti-Semitism had evolved so as to survive the Holocaust. It first originated in religious prejudice. It then became a murderous kind of racial doctrine. and it reemerged as an obsessive hatred of the state of Israel. But here, it's worth noting that Bernard showed great caution lest anti-Semitism be defined too broadly. So let me quote him, because of course no one expresses Bernard's ideas better than Bernard. And here's the quote I'll bring. There is a well-worn platitude that we have all heard many times before. It is perfectly legitimate to criticize the actions and policies of the state of Israel or the doctrines of Zionism without necessarily being motivated by anti-Semitism. The fact that this has been repeated ad nauseum does not detract from its truth. Not only do I accept it, but I would even take it a step further with another formulation that may perhaps evoke surprise, if not shock. Bernard has told us he's going to shock us. Well, that's interesting. Let's watch him in this clip deliberately evoke that surprise and shock from an Israeli audience. This was at the Hebrew University.
Final point, which I wanted to discuss briefly. I think we have to be careful in using the word anti-Semitism or anti-Semite to understand precisely what we're talking about. I will say something which may strike you as absurd, but if you will think for a moment, I think you'll agree that it makes sense. It is perfectly possible to hate Jews, even to persecute Jews, without being anti-Semitic. That strikes you as nonsense. It isn't. What I mean is this: hating people who are different, persecuting people who are different, even on occasion massacring people who are different, is part of the normal human condition. We find it all through history. We find it in every part of the world, in every civilization. Anti-Semitism is distinct in that it attributes to the victim, to the Jews, a kind of quality of cosmic evil, the like of which cannot, as far as I am aware, be found anywhere else.
Now this is quintessential Bernard. And this one clip deserves an essay. The way he sets up his audience, right? The way he surprises it, the way he disarms it. But style aside, and in summary, he says this: anti-Semitism is attributing cosmic evil to the Jews and nothing less than that. All right. So Bernard here isn't repeating the old adage that an anti-Semite is someone who dislikes Jews more than is necessary. Right? It's not the quantity of his hatred that makes an anti-Semite, but its quality. So anti-Semitism isn't just a conventional prejudice. It's not even the conventional prejudice against Jews, which survives in lots of places. As he said, it's distinct, it's unique, as is the Holocaust it produced. Now you might disagree with Bernard. I think it can also be argued that conventional prejudice against Jews creates space for the full-blown anti-Semites around us. But that doesn't negate Bernard's distinction between prejudice against Jews and anti-Semitism. Bernard believed loaded terms should be defined with precision on the basis of a logical distinction. Definition is distinction. A definition shouldn't wander, and it should exclude more than it includes. Now, for Bernard, precision in language was a matter of standards. And that brings me to Bernard and Middle Eastern studies. Now, there have been many criticisms of Middle Eastern studies over the years. As Sarah mentioned, I made one in my book, Ivory Towers on Sand. There are others. Most of these have focused on exposing bias, ideological and political, bias which is endemic in the field. But Bernard made a different criticism, and it was one only he could make credible. He held that Middle Eastern studies didn't uphold the basic standards accepted in other academic fields. And I quote him from 1979 in his article, The State of Middle Eastern Studies. It is painful for a Middle East specialist to admit the fact, but it is nevertheless inescapable. Professional advancement in Middle Eastern studies can be achieved with knowledge and skills well below what is normally required in other more developed fields or more frequented disciplines where standards are established and maintained by a large number of competent professionals over long periods. This has led to low standards of entry at the student level that continue to the professorial level, to low standards of performance, and to low standards of promotion in academic institutions. Now, how many scholars do you know who've taken their own field to task with such brutal honesty? Coming from Bernard, who was the keeper of the highest standards, this critique was absolutely devastating. And it left him a lonely man. I mean, obviously he was disliked by the followers of Edward Said, but he was shunned by the others too, because he questioned their competence and professionalism. And for this refusal to compromise standards, he paid a price. But Bernard was secure enough in his knowledge, strong enough in his convictions, never to compromise standards. Would his limiting definition of anti-Semitism shock his co-religionists? So be it. Would his own critique of Middle Eastern studies alienate his fellow scholars? Couldn't be helped. Bernard insisted on rigor in language and scholarship, no more so than in the Jewish community and the professional guild to which he himself belonged. Now, who does that today? Who does that today with Bernard's authority or style? No one. And that's why we miss him. But that's why people keep quoting him and citing him and arguing with him, even though he rests in a corner of Trumpeldor Cemetery. Now, Bernard, by setting and upholding the highest standards, achieved a measure of immortality. Bernard remains our champion, but he also remains our critic. He held not only those people to high standards, but he holds us to them as well. So let such memorials remind us that we too must raise our standards. When we write, when we speak, let's ask ourselves, what would Bernard think? What must we do to live up to him? There's no better way to honor his memory and to sustain his legacy. Back to you, Sarah.